Hey there, I'm going to tear apart the first van that I built and rebuild it into something better. I've learned a lot working on a bunch of different vans since I first built this one, and so as I deconstruct it, I'm going to reflect on what was good and bad about this van and anything else that's interesting that I find along the way. Hopefully nothing too bad, but I'm curious what I'll see. I had torn out the bed platform a while back because without a back seat, we couldn't use the van as a camper anymore, and having the back open made it easier to use for loading plywood. I took down the upper cabinets first. Each was mounted in a bit of a funky way, but I'm not going to get into that. I picked the back corner with the water system and started taking it apart. A few things had already been dismantled here, but to be honest, this whole area had been cobbled together kind of roughly to begin with. In terms of working with PEX, I used the PEX clamp rings, which really easy to use, work well, never had a problem with them leaking. They are really hard to take off though, because they cinch really tight. There's one tool that can make that a little easier, and it's this little guy. It basically has a little notch and slot in it where you can slide it over one of the PEX clamps and then twist it, and it's just a big lever here. And then it will break it apart basically. There you go, snaps it off. And then you can pry the rest of the clamp ring apart and pull it off. You can see the PEX is pretty deformed where that clamp ring was, so I mainly do this if I want to reuse a fitting, not necessarily reuse the PEX. If you were to reuse some of the actual PEX, I would cut off the end here and start where you have the good tubing. But yeah, handy tool, and what's cool about it is it's just a 3/8 inch socket, which means you could also put it on like a drill and then just have a little more force to turn it. The tank in this system is 25 gallons, and I always found that to be a good size for our use when we were traveling around full time. Now that is without having a shower in here, so I was mainly using it for cooking, drinking, doing dishes, washing hands, just basic stuff. But with 25 gallons and trying to conserve water as much as possible when doing dishes, we would usually get about a week out of a full tank. But when I say conserving water when doing dishes, we really did just like let it trickle and try to use as little water as possible. Let's keep tearing this van apart. So here's something that didn't ever work like I intended it to. So basically in the back corner of the van here, I put in this, it was a 4-inch hole through the floor, a little blast gate to open and close it, and some ducting that went to a fan. And then I, at one point, just ducted it to the back area, but then another point I extended it to a vent in the front. And the whole intention of this was just to be able to bring in some fresh air from the outside, use it in combination with the roof vents just to get more ventilation through the whole van. I don't think it ever made a difference. I think this was just too small to move any significant volume of air, even with the fan added in. So I think the concept was there, but in practice it never seemed to work. Which is why I ended up adding a second roof vent here in addition to the one up front. And that actually helped a lot, especially since this one was right over the bed. When I renovate the van here, I'm going to be swapping one of these fans out for an air conditioner, and that'll be able to cool the space a lot better. But if you don't have an air conditioner and you're going to be in some moderately warm weather, I really recommend having 2 roof vents. Next, I took apart the electrical system. This had already been partially pulled apart, but really, it had always been a little bit of a mess. When I built this, I wasn't practicing what I preach now about having wiring securely clamped down so it can't bounce around. I guess I made friends with mounting zip ties sometime after this one. After this, I pulled apart the front cabinets. I called the cabinet with the cooktop the propane island because it housed all the things related to the propane. From a systems layout perspective, this worked really well because the propane tank locker, the propane heater, the propane cooktop were all close together and minimized where all I had to run propane plumbing. The new layout won't have room for the propane tank inside, and the heater will need to find a new location. I'll use an undermount propane tank on the rebuild, but the 20-pound tank and a vented locker worked great as a cost-effective propane setup. This heater, the Propex HS2000, was always reliable and maintenance-free for us. We had a propane regulator fail on us once, which prevented the heater from being able to fire up even when the stove top still did, but we never had a problem with the heater itself. My only gripe with it is the noise of the fan starting up would wake me up sometimes in the night when the thermostat cycled back on. This isn't really specific to this heater though, as the fan on many of the small diesel and gas heaters sounds pretty similar as it pushes air out the duct. Onto the kitchen sink cabinet. These Camco low-profile drains worked decent, but combined with some of the hose fittings before the gray water jug that was stored under the sink, it couldn't drain as fast as if it was a larger diameter PVC drain. In all builds I've done after this one, I switched to using a Hepvo dry trap, and I think it's a much better option. Notice how open the inner structure of this cabinet is. On the inner dividers, I just added supports where needed for drawer slides and left the rest open to save some weight. The butcher block countertop, on the other hand, is not a great weight saver. I chose it because it's easy to source, easy to work with, and gives a nice warm wood look. I would say it held up well, but I can't as it developed a fairly large crack by the sink. Maybe this was from this area getting wet frequently. I only used mineral oil on it and not a more protective finish. With the front clear, I could begin working on the partition. We liked having the partition, but we don't want it for the new layout. Adding a partition has a big impact on the space. Without it, the van feels more open, and the front seats can be used for lounging if you add swivel bases. With it, there's a clear division between the cab and the rear, which adds some practical benefits. The first is that when looking in the van from the cab, the partition makes it look more like a standard work van versus how it would look if you had something like a divider curtain. The second is when it comes to heating and cooling. By sectioning off the rear space from the hard-to-insulate and window-filled cab, the rear should be a little easier to regulate the temperature of. I don't have a way to quantify how much of a difference this really makes or not, but here is my experience. Even with the top edges of my partition not being fully sealed, after running the heater all night in cold weather, it would be significantly colder in the cab in the morning when we'd open up the partition doors to get ready to drive somewhere. And same thing when we were parked with the hot sun coming in the front windshield. When we'd be in the back and then open up those doors to the front, it would feel much hotter in that front area. It's all a trade-off though, and I'm looking forward to opening up this space in the new layout. Before continuing with the disassembly, let's talk about a couple types of electrical connectors I used in this build. For connecting many items like lights, I used these male and female spade connectors, also called quick disconnect connectors. I think these are a good option, but be sure to wrap the positive and negative individually with some electrical tape, as they usually leave some exposed conductor between the heat shrink. They are nice because they can be disconnected fairly easily and allow you to bridge wire sizes, since the wire leads of small lights are often smaller than the wire running in the camper. I still use these some, but often go for a lever nut splice connector or a closed-end crimp connector instead. Lever nuts have the advantage in that they can easily be disconnected later. To branch a wire into a T, I used a quick splice. After this build, I basically stopped using these quick splice connectors due to concerns about reliability. While I never had a problem with any of them in my van, there's better options. Quick splices are problematic due to their quick and easy but aggressive install method. You put the unstripped wire inside the splice, and then a copper blade slices through the insulation and makes contact with the wire to create an electrical connection between the two wires. Some of the wire strands can get sliced though, which will degrade the connection and can get worse with vibrations over time. These connectors can be even more problematic if you aren't careful matching the correct size wire and splice. Crimp connectors or lever nuts are again the better options. Let's head back to the disassembly. At this point, I took down what remained of the wall and ceiling panels. Both the wall and ceiling panels were cobbled together in a bunch of different sections. Other than having lots of exposed seams, this worked fine and made each panel easier to size and cut. I think having larger continuous panels with less seams looks a lot better though. The segmented ceiling panels were advantageous though because they allowed me to install the back fan much after the rest of the build by just opening up that single ceiling panel section. That's about it for the walls, as I'm going to wait on pulling out this wall framing. I think I'll be able to leave the ceiling framing in place as I like how it was built and bolted in. The wall furring is a little more disconjointed, partly from only using plus nuts in existing holes, so a lot of that I'll probably redo. That's another approach I changed after this build. I basically had avoided drilling any new holes in the van or even using self-tapping screws to attach things, and this made for a little more work, but it did work out. Now, I don't stress adding new holes for threaded rivets, and I just make sure to clean up the metal shavings and prime the new exposed metal edges around the hole. Alright, moving on, let's talk about hardware. The amount of screws that came out up to this point is kind of crazy. It was also interesting to see how the hardware had aged. For a lot of the short screws, I had just used cheap zinc-coated wood screws. While most still looked fine, some were a little rusty. Same with these Craig screws. Most looked fine, but here are some that were screwing some brackets into the subfloor that don't look fine. A better choice is to go with stainless steel screws. If you kind of order them online in a bigger pack, then they really don't cost much more either. This was another change I made after this van. The difference between this van and the projects I worked on afterwards was that this was a build for me and subsequent projects were for clients, and this definitely impacted the materials I chose. Next up, I'm going to pull out the floor, but first, let's check out how the sheet vinyl flooring held up. It's going to look rough in these clips, but the reality is it held up well, except for the high wear areas, until I started being really rough with the van and using it for things like hauling tools around or sliding plywood in and out. That was when the floor really got dinged up and scratched. It can puncture if something sharp enough stabs at it, but you do have to try pretty hard. Okay, now let's pull this floor apart. The vinyl was actually pretty easy to cut with a utility knife and then just pull up in sections. This floor was built with a continuous layer of 1/2-inch XPS insulation and then 1/2-inch plywood subfloor over the top of that. It was fine and sturdy enough, but without anything joining or supporting the plywood seams, you find a little soft spot right by the seam of the two sheets. While the XPS insulation has a fairly high compressive strength, if you concentrate a load enough at one point, it's going to budge a little bit. I think it's worthwhile to sacrifice the continuous insulation to instead add furring strips under the floor, especially right at those seams in the plywood, to make for an overall sturdier floor. Now aside from that, here's what my whole flooring sandwich looked like. All the layers held together great. I went ahead and dug out each screw head to disassemble the subfloor section by section. Once the screws were out, I pried up the plywood from the subfloor, which had an adhesive holding it together. The adhesive gripped the plywood a lot better than the foam board, but it didn't really matter since it was all screwed together. Then I pulled up the plywood and finally this underlayment. I would skip this underlayment here as I don't think it was a worthwhile addition. The rest of the floor sections came up the same. I'll probably leave most of these strips glued down, but I needed to remove a couple for where I'm mounting a seat. That provided a good opportunity to test how well they were adhered. Honestly, they were stuck down really good from just the marine adhesive under them. Some spots separated more easily than others, but for a lot, the plywood broke rather than the adhesive splitting away from the metal. To me, that passed the test of being strong enough with glue alone. But there's one thing I think should be done totally different with these wood strips. Rather than putting them in the low points of the floor, I think you should orient them the other direction and run them across all the high points in the floor, still gluing them down. This can go hand in hand with the above advice on adding support to the subfloor layer. Here's a better example of what that can look like. Alright, that's it for this teardown video. Stay tuned for more videos if you want to see this van get rebuilt. Thanks for watching.